the case a little more here that the Fed is probably making a mistake. I say probably because I have to from a compliance point of view, but I really do believe the Fed is making a mistake. Reflecting a little bit more on the Jackson Hole speech that Chairman Powell gave in late August, we've come to recognize that Chairman Powell really does think he is the reincarnation of Chairman Volcker, that we need him to take a sledgehammer to inflation, much like Volcker did. And history has treated Chairman Volcker very kindly. He did turn the tide on inflation. Now, what he did, though, was he turned a tide that had been building for 15 years. It started in 1964 with the Vietnam War and with the Great Society. So many social programs started at that time under President Johnson. And for 15 years, fiscal and monetary policy pretty much went rogue as we look at history. Even after shocks to the system, like the oil embargo, and the stimulus that came about because of it, both monetary and fiscal policy, we never saw the kind of slowdown in monetary and fiscal policy that we're seeing right now. Federal spending is still down 14% on a year-over-year basis. You never saw a decline in fiscal policy spending in the 70s. Monetary policy seemed to be on automatic pilot back then. The dollar was getting crushed toward the end of the 70s, adding to the inflationary fire. And so Chairman Volcker did choke off money supply and killed inflation. It took a long time for people to believe that inflation had peaked. In fact, I don't think many people believe it peaked as it did in 1981 until 1986 when oil prices crashed. So the inflation expectations were embedded in the system, and it was very difficult, and Volcker did a masterful job. So that was over a 15-year period that inflation had built. By the time the Fed got around to tackling it this time, it was not a 15-year problem. It was a 15-month problem. And from our point of view, it was caused primarily by shocks, major shocks to the system that we had never seen before. We had not had, since Spanish influenza, a global pandemic. And we did not have the supply chain problems, 2 years worth of them, that we had because of the COVID panic. And then, of course, we had another shock to top those off, and that was Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So these are shocks to the system. This was not a period of embedding inflation expectations. And yet, Chairman Powell is taking a sledgehammer that is actually bigger, much bigger. It's at least 6 times bigger right now, and could be 8 to 10 times bigger if the Fed does raise the Fed funds rate another 75 basis points on November 2nd. And what do I mean by that? Well, Chairman Volcker was dealing with double-digit interest rates. He took interest rates from 10% to 20%. Now, by the time he did that, consumers and businesses had gotten used to maneuvering around inflation. So while that sounds shocking, going from 10 to 20%, and it did have some shock value, it wasn't the same as what we're experiencing today with Chairman Powell and the Fed. Today, we've gone from 0.25% on the Fed funds rate to 3.25, which is a 13-fold increase, not a 2-fold increase. Now, many people, I was interviewed by someone the other day and said, oh yeah, but that was such a low base. There's no comparison. In fact, that makes this even more dramatic. That's what's so interesting. People dismiss this way of thinking about it, saying, oh yeah, but the base was so low. The base was so low, and it had been really since 2008 and 9, because we were in a terrible crisis then. And it took a long time to get out of it. And so we did not have inflation expectations built into the system. I really don't believe at all. And yet Chairman Powell is behaving as though what's going on today with inflation is much worse than what Volcker inherited. Starting from a low base is really shocking the system, especially given how long interest rates have been low. So I question the premise of those who say, oh, this is so different. It's such a low base. That's the whole point. It's a low base, 13 times. So if they raise the Fed funds rate another 75 basis points, this will be a 16-fold increase compared to Volcker's 2-fold increase. Now, we have been expecting serious ramifications, financial and other ramifications, because of this monetary policy. And loudly and clearly, somehow, and it may not be showing through in the numbers they want to see, but it will. It will. They are huge lagging indicators. They're basing policy on lagging indicators, not what they're supposed to be doing. Anyway, if you take, in the US alone, if you take equities and bonds and look at what's happened since the peak, you will see that the loss to investors is more than twice what we saw in 08, 09. That's how bad this is. Because bonds are selling off with stocks this time. So and one of the reasons for that is a seizing up of liquidity. As I mentioned, if people are facing margin calls or in financial difficulty, they're going to sell their most liquid asset. They will have no choice, especially with margin calls. Most liquid assets tend to be government bonds, and I think that's why we're seeing the backup in government bonds here, despite all of the deflationary signals in the pipeline. Interestingly, one price indicator associated with innovation is beginning to hold up better than other prices, and that's Bitcoin. It's been interesting to see it flatline in the last month. While other indicators are reaching for new lows. Now, this is not surprising in the late stages of a bear market. In our experience, innovation starts to outperform in the late stages of a bear market. Why does that happen? It happens because innovation is the new leadership. Innovation solves problems. Innovation solves the kinds of problems we have today: supply chain, food, energy shortages, think the genomic revolution, electric vehicles, and so forth. And so we believe that innovation should outperform if we're toward the end of this bear market. If the Fed's close to pivoting, even in its rhetoric, I think we are. So with that, I guess I'd like to reassure you that it feels like we're moving towards a cathartic moment. And, I think that the 75 basis point increase, if that's what the Fed is going to do, is going to result in some financial signals that the Fed will have to pay attention to. Maybe it didn't have to pay attention to the guilt trip, but it should, because it is the reason it should have the guilt trip, because it is the reason that that near Lehman event happened in the UK. And so it is darkest before the dawn. We think the pivot is close, if in nothing else but rhetoric in the short term. And we certainly hope that the Fed gets away from this need for unanimity and a united front, when really we have all of these Fed members and presidents for a reason to debate. And we feel that that debate is being stifled. The debate should be driven by data, but it cannot be. If it were, they would not be unanimous in their thinking right now. So let's hope there are some dissenters, and let's hope there's some rhetoric change. There are all kinds of reasons out there, data-driven reasons. And so we hope the Fed is paying more attention to all of the data instead of just a selected few pieces of lagging indicators.